Hey everyone. Okay, so this comes up all the time and it drives me bananas. So people say that dyslexia, reading disorders cannot be overcome, even though the research does not really show that. But there is other research that leads people to believe that that's the case. So I want to explain to you what's really going on here. Why people say that people with reading disorders and even learning disabilities can't actually overcome this, that it's a permanent thing, it's the way their brain is wired, and so forth. So that is because the research and studies that indicate that it's permanent is based on longitudinal studies in which people who had learning and reading disabilities didn't, overcome it. And why didn't they overcome it? Because they were treated with or addressed with conventional approaches. So they were not addressed from a perspective or a knowledge of the science of neuroplasticity and that the brain can change. It was, these people typically as children went through tutoring programs, remedial reading programs, learning centers, and so forth that focused on compensations and that heavily relied upon tutoring, IEPs, assistive technology, and even medication as a solution. So, of course, these people are not going to overcome a reading difficulty if that is the sole focus. If you just focus on practicing the problem, which is so much of what the approach is in education when there are learning difficulties, then that's the result we are going to get. If we want to get a approach that is corrective as opposed to compensations, then we need a bottom-up approach that addresses the weak connections, that nourishes, first of all, the brain and makes sure that the brain's biochemistry is, optimal in terms of there's the optimal learning environment for those connections to be formed. But then we need to identify what connections are weak and then strengthen those connections. So absolutely not true that kids cannot overcome learning and reading difficulties. The science truly and definitely shows the opposite to that. But it has to be based on the principles of neuroplasticity in terms of the therapies and interventions that you choose. Because ultimately, what this boils down to is that the only difference between a weak learner and a star student is the connections in their brain. And what we have shown is that when we create stimulations and different exercises and target the weak areas of the brain, those connections change. And that's why you hear these incredible stories of someone who went through a different type of learning intervention that targeted the weak connections, like Barbara Aerosmith is like a beautiful classic example of that, right? Once diagnosed as mentally retarded as per the wording and standards of the 1950s, and she will say I definitely was. It wasn't a misdiagnosis, but she retrained her brain and now runs all these schools. So this can be overcome when we don't take the conventional approach that focuses on compensations, but we focus on corrective approaches that uses the principles of neuroplasticity to change the brain. So it should not be about more practice. And so often that is the problem, is when a kid has a hard time with reading, they need more reading is what we decide. When a kid has writing difficulties, we do little writing programs with them. We practice those fine motor skills like nobody's business, not understanding that this has to do with retained primitive reflexes, often left brain overdevelopment, poor core stability, gross motor development precedes fine motor development. And we need to address all of that before we start focusing on fine motor skills. And it's the same thing even when there's behavior issues, right? We have behavior plans and parenting strategies and all of these, time blocking and all this stuff that isn't bad, but it is not a permanent solution because it's not a corrective solution. So if you're feeling discouraged, you feel like you've tried everything, you've exhausted all your options, your kid is giving you a hard time, or maybe they aren't giving you a hard time, they're not at that phase where they've given up or checked out like so many of the older kids I have worked with, but they're just, kind of shutting down or feeling not so good about themselves, it's affecting their self-esteem. Ask yourself, have I really exhausted every option, or have I just done conventional approaches, which is fine because when you know better, you do better. And I was in that same path at one time with my daughter until I learned a whole other world was available for me. So the focus you want to be, or what you want to focus on is number one, identifying what's weak and imbalanced in terms of brain biochemistry, and then weak and imbalanced in terms of connections in the brain. And then you want to strengthen them. That's how you get out of this hamster wheel of everything feeling like it takes so long and it's going to take forever and years and years and years and, thousands upon thousands of dollars of all of these reading programs and resources and so forth. Get off the hamster wheel by focusing on the root cause and corrective solutions that address that root cause. Because really what this boils down to is you're trying when you have your child in tutoring, you're trying to have your child do something that their brain is really not equipped for. They don't have the connections for. And you know what? Here's a perfect example. Imagine you go to the gym, you weigh, I don't know, like 100 pounds. You're not very big. And you decide, I'm going to start lifting those 300-pound weights. The crazy heavy weights, whatever they're called, that the bodybuilders lift when they're, doing competitions. So if you start off weighing 100 pounds, thinking you're going to be lifting 300-pound weights, and you just say, I'm just going to practice, practice, practice. Well, most likely you probably are going to injure yourself in the process of practicing, but worse than that, or whatever, you're just going to be like lifting it every day a little bit, and you're probably not going to get very far because you're not focusing on strengthening the foundational muscles, those smaller muscles, and working your way through. And so what really has to happen is you have to build the brain from the bottom up with nourishment and then connections. That is the key. So that's where you want to focus. If you start at the top of the learning pyramid with tutoring and practicing and IEPs and technology and all that stuff, instead of starting down here, it's going to very much, the research will show that you cannot overcome this because you're not starting where you're supposed to be starting. So determine what's weak, nourish it, strengthen it, and that is how you get off the hamster wheel. So if you want to learn more, I will be doing a live training this Friday, how improving, these key connections can improve reading so that kids can overcome reading issues. And this really, even if your child has a writing or learning disability, will pertain to that as well. And as always, if you want to book a free clarity call to learn more about my program, The Full Potential Formula, reach out. I'll put a link for that in the comments below after I'm done, and book a call. Have a fantastic day, everyone. Take care.